who will speak us about the draft plan to date. So welcome to you all.
Kia ora koutou. Staff will do a presentation shortly, but first of all I'd like to introduce you to Daryl Miller, who's the independent chair of the Coastal panel. Daryl's not actually staff, just to clarify.
I was a long time ago.
So Daryl will just provide you with a bit of an opening statement about the process to date.
Kia ora, everyone. I'm going to provide some introductory comments on the draft plan and then hand over to the council team. First, however, I want to acknowledge the hard mahi of the panel, the CHAP team, the STAG, the Runanga, and the Council's Coastal Hazards Working Group for their contribution to the development of the draft plan. Equally worthy of acknowledgement are the many groups and individuals that have contributed during the various community engagements. This includes the numerous parties that have provided the most recent feedback on the draft plan, and some of whom are presenting today. One of the purposes of establishing the panel was to provide a community voice and representation in this process. As you will be aware, the panel comprises a diverse range of community, youth and Runanga representatives. They worked in their communities endeavouring to raise awareness of coastal hazard issues and the plan preparation process itself. This mahi sat alongside and complemented the formal engagement processes managed by the Council's community and engagement team. And with that in mind, I also want to thank Crystal Anderson and James Richardson for their efforts. This draft plan has been developed from community feedback, detailed assessment and expert advice. No draft plan will, however, be perfect. That is why this final engagement process, the feedback received, and the presentations you will hear today are important to your consideration of the plan. This is particularly so given that the draft plan provided a comprehensive explanation of the preferred and alternate adaptation pathways for Three Waters, transport and park assets, and also provided recommendations around the wider transport network as well. This is, for the want of a better phrase, the pointy end of the process, where communities could finally view and comment on the fully developed draft plan. The process for developing the draft plan is summarised on page 14 of the document itself. This includes an outline of the community and targeted children, youth engagements undertaken. Crystal will elaborate on the engagement process shortly. The draft plan is the result of a significant investment in time, research, engagement and assessment, with the draft plan's proposals founded in strong technical support from the STAG and the Council's CHAP team, as well as the significant input from the Runanga and communities across months of feedback gathering. When considering adaptation options, they were assessed by the panel for alignment with community objectives, which were established through public engagement. The options were also scored for effectiveness, feasibility, and environmental impact by the STAG, alignment with mana whenua values by Runanga, and the Council's guiding principles by Council staff. The Coastal Panel has, however, faced numerous challenges in settling on the preferred adaptation pathways. These include the complexity and varying nature of the environments, communities, and the hazard and risk profiles, operating in a space of significant uncertainty given current knowledge and the plan horizon timeline, and the need to provide workable options for the future, and considering pathway options within the context of the wider area and the need to balance competing priorities and the cost for the Council and for ratepayers. On the issue of certainty and whether the draft plan's pathways are flexible enough to accommodate change, the panel recognises that the adaptation pathways traverse significant timeframes. Within this context, it may not always be possible to provide the certainty that communities and possibly the council itself is looking for. This is a product of the complex nature of the environment we are working in, the currently understood risk profile, and the timelines involved. This is not a weakness in the process undertaken or in the pathways identified. Rather, the Dynamic Adaptation Pathways Planning approach, DAP, which has been used, allows us to plan now despite the potential unknowns around the level and timing of climate impacts. Rather than having concrete timeframes outlining when actions and responses are required, the implementation of pathways identified in the draft plan will be informed by a range of signals, triggers, and thresholds. In many cases, the big investment decisions or other changes proposed in the draft plan are not expected for many decades. Consequently, while the draft plan has identified preferred pathways, a range of alternatives are also provided. This approach provides decision agility for the council and the community. While we may have more certainty about adaptation pathways in the short term, unsurprisingly, this certainty decreases in the long term. Given this, the alternate options provided in the plan recognise that we may need to consider pathway changes in the future. The overall benefit of this is that it identifies issues now that the council and communities will face going forward. This heightened awareness is critical to the future planning decisions the council may make. This is particularly so given that the long-term prioritisation exercise that the council may need to make, not only within this adaptation area, but also across the wider district as other adaptation plans are rolled out. Thank you.
Thanks, Daryl. We'll now move into a brief staff presentation. I'm going to shoot through the first few slides pretty quickly because it is all well outlaid in the plan. This slide is just to remind you that the plan for the priority locations was developed by the Coastal Panel, as Daryl has outlined, and the names of the Coastal Panel representatives there. They did include representatives from Te Runanga o Kokorarata and Te Hapu o Ngāti Wheki. We've calculated there was about 100 hours of mahi involved over 20 workshops, so there's been a significant contribution I'd really like to acknowledge from the Coastal Panel. Again, Daryl has touched on this really well in terms of saying that we are not wedded to timelines and dates, and we're not wedded to our preferred pathway. So this process does allow for a lot of flexibility in the future as circumstances change over time. I'm now going to hand it to Crystal to talk about our engagement.
Cool. So I'll just really briefly touch on the engagement process for this program to date. So we started in 2022. And we engaged with local communities to understand what people value in the area and what community assets were important to them. Up here you can see some photos from that engagement. So some of the cool things that we did were a tile painting event at Allendale Hall where people painted the things that they love about the coast. And we also ran some events with schools. Down the bottom there you can see a photo from one of our beachinars where people were able to come along and find out about the hazards on the coast and tell us about what they valued. From that engagement, we heard from just under 300 people, and that feedback was used by the Coastal Panel to create those community objectives that Daryl touched on. So in 2023, we went out again. This engagement was when we had some adaptation options on the table the Coastal Panel was looking into. So we went out to test how the community was feeling about those options. In that, we developed a brochure about every priority adaptation location and did some promotion of those. In this engagement, as well as doing community markets, webinars and all those kinds of things, we also sent flyers to all of the properties in the area. So it was just under 2,000 properties. And then 2024, our latest engagement last year, so this was our formal engagement on the draft plan. this, we did a whole bunch of community meetings. So we reached out to a lot of the community groups in June last year to set up some community hosted events. We know that community hosted events tend to get more people along than council hosted events. So that was really successful. We had a great event at Diamond Harbour and in Governor's Bay. We reached out to all the groups, and we did hear back from some of the Port Levy residents during the Governor's Bay community meeting. So we were able to set up a meeting with them a little bit later in the piece, and they were given some extra time to put in their submissions. So from this engagement, we had over 8,000 views to the webpage. So really high engagement with the content, but we got 88 submissions. So 88 submissions overall. In terms of the feedback we got, so 57% of total submitters said that they support or somewhat support the plan. The way that we asked the questions for this was that people could provide feedback on the plan overall, or they could provide just feedback on a specific asset or area. So not everyone chose to answer that question around overall support. So if we just look at the people that answered that question, which was 67, then we've got 76% of the submitters saying that they did support the plan overall or somewhat support it. Those who said they somewhat supported it said in general they thought most of it was good, but there was one asset that they had concern with or something they wanted us to have another look into. In terms of feedback on different assets, this is all detailed within the report, but I thought I'd just touch on the ones that we got the most comments on. So for the foreshore track in Governor's Bay, the majority of comments we got on that one did not support the Coastal Panel's preferred pathway, and there was a want to see that track maintained into the future. The Governor's Bay Teddington Road, we received 23 comments on that and 19 didn't support the Coastal Panel's preferred pathway. A lot of the comments on that are around maintaining that road at its current level of service. For Marine Drive in Charteris Bay, we received 15 comments for that, and we got 12 people saying that they really supported that pathway and that it was an important road. There was definitely a lot of comments as well around the opportunity to provide some pedestrian safety in protecting that road. The Charteris Bay boat ramp, again, the majority didn't support the Coastal Panel's preferred pathway, and they wanted to see that boat ramp protected for longer. And then Wharf Road, we received 17 comments about Wharf Road, and 16 of those didn't support the pathway, and they would like to see that road protected into the future.
Great. So in response to the feedback from submitter, staff are recommending some changes to 3 pathways, and Tom will go through those in a minute. I just wanted to touch on the point 4 up there, which was the amendments that we're proposing in the table 1 in the report. Those are largely to reflect the changes that need to be made to text to support the changes to recommendations above it. If those recommendations are not agreed by council, those changes would not occur. However, we did hear a lot of feedback around the terminology that we used, and some of the questions really identified that we could be clearer. So other changes in that table recommend changes to clarify terminology in the glossary so that it's a little bit more accessible to communities. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And I'll hand over now to Tom.
Kia ora team. So I'm going to take you through those 3 recommendations from staff, which have largely resulted from feedback that we've received late last year through our engagement phase. So starting with the foreshore track. So really what we heard in this case is a lot of recognition of the value of that track to local users. We heard a lot from the local school group, Governor's Bay, and how it helps connect them to other places such as the Allendale Reserve and a larger domain and the hall itself, and that generally that community values that asset and its amenity value. We also, through consultation, was reflagged around the importance of that track in terms of access to council's pumping station, so we've sought to make a re-clarification, which I'll touch on there. In terms of what the recommendation actually was originally for the foreshore track, essentially to maintain the track for a time before over time accepting a reduction in level of service. Essentially what that means is in time as sea levels rise, we expect the track will be overtopped by waves and tides more often, and that we might need to accept those impacts. So perhaps during big tides or storms, it's not accessible for people to use, and it will generally become in greater disrepair over time. That being said, I do want to flag two things. One is that council have about $700,000 set to spend on repairing sections that are currently in disrepair, and that's planned for the next 6 to 12 months. And also in the plan would set aside $1 million to also give some additional life to that asset. So a lower level of service, while that is the recommended pathway, there would still be investment in that asset to give it some time. And you can see that we've suggested that the track would be retained out to around 40 years before the recommended pathway is to move towards a closure of that track. The other thing to touch on here is sort of why haven't we just recommended to protect the track forever? We did look at the alternative, or two alternatives, one of which is included as an alternate option in the plan. That one being essentially defend the track in its existing location. It's about 3 odd kilometres long, and to build a shoreline defence and to raise that track to the necessary height to allow it to be there for a long period of time would be significant cost, and we've estimated that at around 13 million. So that's just to give you an indication of why that hasn't been the recommendation. Cool. In terms of the recommended change that staff have made, effectively this is, or you can see in the image up the top right, we've got the orange sort of snaking section of the track, which is between the Governor's Bay jetty and Council's pumping station. So we're just wanting to re-clarify in here that the recommendation would be to protect that relatively short section of track, which is a couple of hundred of metres, to retain access to that critical service for council. So that pump station services around 300 properties and around 1,000 people. And that recommendation would come with an additional cost of around $3 million as well. Then I think last thing to sort of touch on here, or to re-clarify, is we do recognise that this would be a loss in terms of access between Governor's Bay and Allendale. The coastal panel did consider this really seriously. The cost of the alternative of protection, which I've alluded to, is significant. We also looked at the possibility of an alternate route through the landward area, which would be particularly challenging and even more expensive and impactful. So that has not been the recommendation by staff. Cool. On over the hill to Teddington. Before we crack into this, just want to explain what the recommendation was by the coastal panel in the first case. So we've got this orange line being Charteris Bay Road and the yellow line referring to Governor's Bay to Teddington Road. So the recommendation in the plan for the orange section of road, Charteris Bay, and the lower section of Gebbies Pass, was to maintain that road, but as impacts increase, to effectively raise that section of route above future flood levels. So essentially to raise the road level to minimise impacts and retain access. People that drive along that route can either take a left at Gebbies Pass and go that way into the city and other parts of the wider district, or continue straight along towards Allendale and into the city. And as we get to the yellow line, the recommendation by the panel was to maintain that road for a period of time before transitioning towards a reduction in level of service. So essentially, again, like what I talked about for the track, perhaps initially disruptions in the periods of hours and maybe a couple of times a year, timed with things like spring or king tides or particularly heavy rainfall events, where the road might be temporarily shut to traffic. And in those instances, traffic could detour via Gebbies Pass. The long-term recommendation for that yellow line was to also look at floodproofing, likely raising of that section to essentially secure that access route, but at that lower level of service. So I guess what I want to sort of be really clear on here is just that, and this was wrongly reported when the plan was released late last year, was that there was a suggestion that that road would be closed, the Governor's Bay to Teddington Road, and that is not the recommendation in the plan. The recommendation in the plan is towards a reduction in levels of service before subsequent flood proofing. Cool. Yeah, so just to, I want to first touch on some of the feedback we received to effect on Governor's Bay Teddington Road, so that yellow line on the previous slide. We had a lot of people sort of flagging that that's a critical link through to the city, and that there would be obviously a detour required via Gebbies Pass. Also flagged that it would be, that plan is sort of predicated on State Highway 75 over Gebbies Pass also being maintained to an appropriate standard. And largely there are also comments around civil defence and emergency access via that route. With all that feedback in mind, the recommendation that staff have made is essentially to add an additional adaptation option. It wouldn't become the recommendation in the plan, but would be included as an alternative option, and that would essentially be to raise the section of Governor's Bay to Teddington Road in the same way as what is proposed for Charteris Bay Road. The reason we do feel that's an appropriate recommendation is partly it provides council with greater flexibility in the future, and also it recognises the fact that previously the plan was somewhat or could be precluded by an outcome on the other side of Gebbies Pass Road, and now we'd be more resilient to that possible change. Cool. 1 second, sorry, team. Cool. So now over the hill, over past Puro and to Kokorarata and Wharf Road. The preferred pathway in the adaptation plan for Wharf Road is again to have a period of maintenance followed by a transition to a lower level of service. I feel like I've sort of articulated what that might involve, so I won't sort of labour that point. And then at that, around, we've estimated around 40 years from now is our best guess that there would be a transition to a partial or full closure. We want to sort of, and this is one of the edits that Jane alluded to earlier in terms of the plan, re-clarifying the terms reduced or lower level of service, and also what we meant by the closure in this case. You can see there that staff note that alternate access options could be explored with local landowners well in advance of that closure that we've alluded to in that sort of 40-50 year time frame. So that's absolutely something that staff are, of course, open to exploring. In terms of that bottom red text box, a wide range of submissions from the Wharf Road residents, which were very much sharing similar messages, that loss of that access would have a significant implication for private properties and for businesses and the such, and that they'd like us to further explore the alternatives, one of which was included in the plan, which is that flood proofing and protection, which you can see, and then another which I'll flick to on the next slide. So I guess in response to the submitter feedback, staff have recommended again towards the inclusion of an additional alternate option for Wharf Road, which would involve essentially moving or reconstructing a new route further inland. So this is for the section of Wharf Road at the head of Port Levy Harbour. So essentially there's a section of Wharf Road that is very much low-lying, a gravel section, before you get alongside the harbour and travel along. The road climbs up to much steeper elevations and is not at nearly the same level of risk from coastal hazards, at least not in the initial sort of coming decades. So the recommendation by staff is to include that option to accommodate the possibility of an additional landward route. Want to sort of touch on why staff have recommended that the preferred pathway remains the same, that yellow line. The alternate option of floodproofing and protection, so effectively raising that section of route, would cost around 10 to 15 million. This depends on the scale of road raising. There are 2 bridges there, so there's significant costs associated with essentially raising those pieces of asset to that additional height as well, and the associated stormwater and drainage management work as well. The move the road inland pathway has been costed around $16 million, so it's a similar cost to the floodproofing option. So effectively, both of those alternate options, which would be recommended for inclusion in the plan, do come with significant costs, but obviously we note that there would be a benefit for private landowners through that. I think. Yeah. Cool.
Okay, just to wrap up, we have a few key messages here that are a little bit tough. The first one is, realistically, we are not going to be able to do everything we want to do in the future and maintain the same level of service right across the district as we see these impacts occurring. We've got modelling that suggests around about $3.2 billion of council roads and Three Waters infrastructure could be impacted with 20 centimetres of sea level rise. That's the middle of the century. That's only 25 to 30 years away. So ratepayers will be under increasing pressure as we respond to these risks, and we will need to start thinking about how we prioritise investments across the district. We're very mindful of the fact we are working in Whakaropo and Kokorarata only at the moment. With that in mind, the Coastal Panel have really proposed compromises that they felt were appropriate within the local context and with their local knowledge and understanding. And I really give them credit for that. Of course, it's really important to hear a wider group of people today and test those perspectives. There is no silver bullet. Every one of our adaptation pathways comes with compromises and changes, and that's something we're all going to learn to have to deal with. However, we know that for everybody that's difficult, and some of the submitters today will be indicating that there are some significant losses for them through this process, which we do acknowledge. I think we've been quite clear about the fact that this plan is flexible, so I won't labour that point any further. And I guess, again, you've also heard that some of our language and concepts, things like terms like road stopping, road closure, reduced levels of service, we can do better. We'd like to do better in articulating those to communities, and that's something we'll take away as a learning for the next part of our process. So thank you very much for your time. That's a wrap from us at the moment.
So we'll do some questions first, and these guys will come back afterwards because I want to get on to the submitters. We've got Tim, Sarah, Kelly and Yanni.
You may have mentioned it before, and I just want to concur with Mr. Miller's comments. So thank you very much for all your work. It's been outstanding. Nothing's ever perfect, but you've done a hell of a lot of work, so I really appreciate it. First of all, the $3.2 billion, because this is really focused on Banks Peninsula, does that cover the entire city? So from Waimak through, okay. And it also includes the possible risks with LPC, etc., or was that an extra on top?
That is just the council road network and Three Waters network pipes. Yeah.
Thank you.
And just for coastal hazards.
Yeah. So with the, just a nice little local issue, with the pump station in the Governor's Bay, does that have an access off the main road, or is it all through the walkway?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, it is along that track. We did talk about possible route from the south, but that has an even longer stretch of track that would need to be
up, not
not existing.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you. Just
Okay, Sarah, please.
Kia ora. Thank you so much for all of this. Council often gets accused of, putting out things that are predetermined, those kind of things, not engaging enough beforehand. Would it be fair to say that in this particular case, this is probably the most engagement and early development of stuff we've ever had as a council before even developing a plan?
Yeah, this has been a very unique engagement process for council, and it's been great to have the ability to work alongside community members in actually developing that plan, and to have chickens with the wider community along the way has meant that actually, the community have had a really good opportunity to feed into this draft.
And to clarify, while this is a staff report today with staff recommendations in blue on the report, the recommended pathways in the plan are ones that have been recommended by the Community Coastal Panel. Is that right?
That's
Yeah.
correct.
And any of the future moves that need to be made, such as the road movings, those kind of things, they would be additionally consulted on at the time that council was starting to think about them, engaged and consulted on.
Yeah, so there would be whatever engagement or communication needed at the time where you make those distinct decisions about
Yeah.
whatever assets.
Yeah. So the decisions today and on this particular plan provide pathways, but they're not the end of the decision making when it comes to these moves.
Correct.
Yeah. Thanks.
Kelly?
Yeah, thanks. Fantastic plan. It's so good to see council preparing for all future possibilities. I'm just curious in terms of once the plan is sort of set in place, I mean, do we have a formal mechanism for trigger points, etc., for action? And
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for that. We were able to secure additional resources through the LTP, which will allow us to appoint an implementation lead. And that person will be bringing together the signals and triggers in this under the umbrella of a monitoring framework, which will help us when we move into other parts of the district to have consistency around the way we monitor these impacts. And part of that role will be to establish some structures and processes for revisiting this in the future, because, as you rightly point out, there will be decisions coming in the future. This isn't sort of a once and done situation. So we'll be coming back and reporting on how that function will work. It hasn't yet been determined, but we have a bit of time to do so.
yeah, because I think it would be really good, you know, if people have some data that they can sort of follow and see the trends, because I imagine it would accelerate or slow, whatever. You know.
Absolutely, and we're also really interested in incorporating into that some citizen science and some community-led reporting as we roll this out. So yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Now, just we've got 4 more questions at this stage. We will be able to ask questions later on after the submitters, but the first submitter's supposed to be now. So if we start, we'll do these 4 questions, but please keep them real brief, because if we start late, we'll finish late. Yanni, please.
Thank you, and just obviously to acknowledge the huge amount of work that you've done in engagement and consultation. I guess that's why I was quite surprised with the Wharf Road that the feedback has been concern around a perceived lack of consultation. So I was just wondering if there's a way that we could carve out that section to enable a greater degree of engagement and consultation before we make decisions on it.
So the Wharf Road residents, yes, they have indicated in their submission that they don't feel they were consulted. The fact that they've made submissions and that they're here to talk to you today shows that they have definitely engaged in the process. They have had the opportunity to feed into this. I think what has come through in the submissions is perhaps a little bit of shock that the road closure could mean something of a change for them. It's probably important to note that in the plan it states that any future changes and assets that would affect private property owners would be discussed with those property owners when it was relevant. For Wharf Road, for example, we're looking at potentially 20 to 40 years before anything becomes relevant. And so those landowners might not be the same. They might be different. We could have different funding mechanisms. We could have different forms of engagement. So they have definitely been part of this process, and they will be again when it becomes relevant.
Thank you, Yanni. Vic?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm interested in the decision-making process and reaching the recommendations, and I'm mindful that the funding pathways is out of scope of the meeting today. I'm still keen to understand what, if any, weighting did you give to funding when reaching your recommendations?
So the process of options development and assessment that was undertaken was one of multi-criteria decision making. So effectively we pull on a suite of qualitative analysis. So the STAG, the Specialist and Technical Advisory Group, assess the options and pathways against, let's say, technical criteria, for lack of a better descriptor. The Coastal Panel assess it against the community input, which was those community objectives, and then Runanga for their own views and values, for example. And then there was a suite of other sort of criteria that come to play. We've also undertaken significant costing development with our technical services and design unit team for both the preferred options and pathways and the alternative options. So effectively, those numbers, those costings then come in and sit alongside that other qualitative analysis, and the panel have had that information in front of them to make these recommendations. So an understanding of cost, an understanding of environmental implication, effectiveness and other criteria, and then have put forward their recommendations based on that. We haven't taken a formal cost-benefit analysis approach, but have taken that more qualitative assessment approach.
If I could just add to that, Tom, thank you, that the panel had access to those various assessments, and so when it considered the various pathway options, it was considering in the context of a range of potential impacts that might arise, environmental, economic, social, etc.
Thank you.
I'm grateful for that. Just one more final question. Really satisfied about the comprehensive and robust process, particularly around the pre-engagement, and it's great to hear that there's been so many hits on the website. But I was somewhat surprised then that there were only 88 submissions when there's been 8,000 hits on the website. Any comment on that?
Yeah, we do see this frequently when we consult on future-focused projects, particularly things that are complex, just like this process is. What I can say is from our out and about face-to-face engagement, there were definitely a lot of people aware of the program. There was a lot of comments around the tune of, council knows what it's doing, those kinds of things. So I think people were aware, but didn't necessarily feel the need to say anything about it. And I think the fact that we got those views on the website shows that they are definitely engaging with the content.
Thank you. Melanie, and then Aaron, and we'll get into it. You're right? Good. Aaron?
Yeah, I was a little concerned over those lack of numbers submitting, and also the disagreement was that's very Banks Peninsula, which is good to see. It's robust. The numbers, the pricing numbers, I'm finding a little bit alarming. Like the coastal pathway at 3 kilometres at 13 million. That's $4,300 per linear metre. I mean, making it a metre higher in solid concrete, $600 a linear metre for the concrete. It seems like it's alarmist rather than just solution focused.
I can talk you through how we've generated the costing. So our parks team are currently engaging a contractor to look at the costs it would take to repair sections of that track, and they're repairing very discrete parts of that track to the order of $700,000. We've effectively applied that methodology across a larger expanse of track,
right,
and also recognised the fact that what they are doing is small ad hoc repairs, and what we're talking about is raising a section of seawall significantly higher. And we also need to consider that the fact that the track would ideally also be raised to accommodate that, because if you don't, then waves overtop it, and then you just have essentially water everywhere.
Yes, it's a phenomenal number. And then the 3.2 billion, so that suggests it's a sixth of all of Christchurch's assets would be affected, but they all get replaced in a cycle anyway, like no asset's more than 100 years old, essentially. So they're in a replacement. So the cost is not 3.2 billion.
The point up there is that's the cost, that's the amount of
assets
that's at risk.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Right. Thank you very much, guys. And we'll get into it. Now, the first one is on behalf of